Freud saw everything as like a manifestation of like primitive impulses, pre-conventional. Jung did kind of like the opposite, seeing all this basic manifestation of the psyche as transpersonal. The mistake that Jung did is to have made this the following assumption is that because something like an archetype or a symbol or any kind of psychic structure was universal, that meant that it was a primordial motif. So that there was something transpersonal, spiritual about it. And Kant says, at the end, we all have 10 toes. And there's no spiritual wisdom in having 10 toes. So basically, what Kant says is that when Jung puts all those like archetypes and symbol and myth, all this collective, universal structures, Jung presented that as like essential landscapes that would help us understand and discover something really deep about ourselves. What Kant says is that that is actually only revealing something very primitive about ourselves. So he says that actually most archetypes are not really archetypes, they are actually prototypes. Proto in the sense of like early, right?
The archetypes were the highest level of subtle before it became causal. The archetype itself is only a pattern. It doesn't have a content. It's just a loose structure, and it could manifest in many different ways. And for Ken, that was the last level of subtle because it still contained a shape and a form. After that, it went formless.
That everything we create or everything that we use does represent very deep structures.
Is everyone familiar with the word teleology? It's like an internal form that has a pull, and all things, as they manifest, are drawn towards that internal form. And it's this like unchangeable, outside of time, always has been force. This is a guess, but what I'm getting from Wilber is that he thinks that archetypes are teleological, that they existed before time and they have this eternal draw, which causes things to manifest in a certain way. And what he's saying is that they're not beyond form, they're not that spiritually aligned. They're this like basic underlying building block, like the first thing out of causal subtle structure. So they're like something that we play with and we then work on top of.
So it's self-evident.
Yeah. I mean, they're like atoms. Atoms are this like really basic building block. They've been around for so long, we're not really going to change them. They're going to manifest in different ways. But they're not this like spiritual force that is causing us to act a certain way.
Ego's mental.
So
It's mental. It's an image. It's an image. It's an image of you, that you have of yourself in your mind. When you get to centaur level, you still have ego, but you're now embodying. I kind of think that it implies a gross level because there has to be a thinker for there to be a mental image. So that's the gross. That's the person. In other words, you're getting a mental image of yourself. You have to have a self to image. So I think that mental image is it's an achievement of the ego. You start off with a gross self, and you don't have an ego. You're in Piaget's sensory motor phase, and that's pre-egoic. So the ego is an accomplishment of the gross self.
That's your understanding? That's the integral understanding?
I'm riffing, man.
For when you reach the transpersonal personal stages, religion becomes increasingly pure spirituality. So for him, the main spiritual accomplishment is really only formless. Okay. So yeah, no, just gonna finish that and you go. But Ken sees every myth as forms of like infantile from like evolutionary point of view, right? Forms of spirituality. For him there is really, it's fine for people that are in pre-conventional, conventional stages. But if you want to go up the ladder, you need to leave everything behind.
That doesn't make him dismissive of changing culture, so it allows room for different archetypes to manifest differently.
But not using archetypes, as far as I can tell. Look, I don't want to talk for Ken
No, I mean,
as much as he says.
but he's also not talking about everyone should be at this highest level. He's talking about all the levels that exist.
Yeah, but it's not that. I mean, you find a quote, but I think he's not that interested in that.
Integral's preference for the ascending path versus the descending path. Because if archetypes are foundational, and they were here even before us, and the causal birthed them as the highest level of subtle before even us, why are we not honoring that? Why is that less than, or in
Because
any
for
way?
Ken, that's true for your toes. The design for 10 toes was there before you. And that, I'm just,
Right,
and this is not my opinion about it, right?
I'm trying to
But so
understand.
for him, he says, you're not going to worship your 10 toes because all the animals, like, millions of years before you had already 10 toes. It doesn't, it's not because it's universal, it's not because it's there since the beginning of times, that it actually has a spiritual wisdom to it. This is what it is.
So I go back to, maybe we should worship our 10 toes. And I know I always bring this up, but I have to say it because, again, talking about enlightenment as being the formless and being an emptiness, there's a video clip of Ken on YouTube talking about what enlightenment looks like when the female becomes enlightened. And he talks about Mother Teresa and the way that she and her people physically went and took care of lepers. And he talks about what it looks like when a woman is enlightened, is an embodied experience that might look like licking the wounds of a leper.
Looking at what's actually the purpose then of integral, because when you said not honoring the toes or the archetypes, it seems to me like you can honor them and yet be looking at where we're trying to go integrally beyond where we're at right now. We look beyond the polarities of male and female. So you're not even necessarily looking at whether it's a woman or a man trying to integrate the male or the female, but what actually is the result when you step beyond those kinds of polarities. So you recognize all of it, and you recognize everything that came before, but you're actually looking for where we're going next that takes us to the next level. Because I think otherwise we get too caught up in bringing the feminine in to balance or enhance the masculine, but it's still from a perspective of the dualism and the polarity between the two versus what actually arises. And that's why I think it's actually, that's where the spirituality comes in. Because spirit doesn't have to do with gender at all. Spirit, pure spirit,
Yeah.
formless,
Yeah.
doesn't have to do with gender. It's pre and post gender in a certain way.
And what I understood Ken says, because that's pretty much the same sound.
And it doesn't deny that, everything that we can identify in culture as imbalance, it's not denying the existence of those imbalances. I think that's very true and real, and it's brought us to where we are today in both the positive and the negative aspects. But I don't know, what I get interested in personally is like what's beyond all of that, rather than trying to put a lot of weight on either the masculine or the feminine.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by beyond. I keep thinking transcend and include. So to me, there's never a beyond, because the prior things always come with. So therefore, what you have is both masculine and feminine, and the two together are more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah. But wouldn't that then, because again, I'm just kind of interested in this point of like, how do you look, how do you go, basically, I think that transcend and include, you don't include everything. I mean, you include the things that take you to the next level, you know? and
I
things
disagree. I think you include everything. And anything you don't include ends up in shadow, and that's the difference between the definition of shadow and integral versus the Jungian shadow. Anything you don't include is shadow.
About privileging the formless and not including the form, like where does it go? And I mean, is this like a big problem, like with this vision of, I don't know, with the formless?
I think we're talking about them like they're separate, but you
Yeah,
have to be able to hold both, and it is a paradox, and you have to be okay with that.
Agree.
And we're like kind of privileging one over the other and arguing over which one should be privileged, but that's not.
Right, that's
and
what
I
I'm
think
saying.
we often do that, I
Right.
think, and it's a challenge not to.
And I think Ken is saying what you're saying, but he's not denying the other half of the equation when he's saying.
I agree.
When he's talking about the highest levels of development, he's very much talking about this transcendent kind of non-dual space that has a lot of formlessness, and that's like the most important realization. But that doesn't mean that you don't wake up in the morning and like fight for women's rights in Iraq.
So it's like you have these upper chakras, like you were saying, ascending, and the lower chakras descending. So for me, where I'm at now is, I want it all.
Later on, you know, Ken's definition of enlightenment is freedom and fullness, and I think that freedom is the formless, and the fullness is the fullness of form. So you have to have, so it's really the highest points of both. So they go together. They're like woven together, like two strands. So we have to. So the archetypes in that can be thought of. Exploring that is like the fullness part, right? Getting in touch with, you know, the embodiment, and then the freedom is what you